Hi everyone. Today we'll be converting a few Xbox power supplies to power pass-through mods. These don't have an on-off switch. There's two of the wires in the cable operate a remote switch, which is on the Xbox. So we'll do two things. In one case, we'll add an external switch onto the power supply. And for the other one, we'll use the two wires that run down the cable, which will operate a remote switch on the pass-through mod here. And that's what'll turn the power supply on and off. So stick around and we're going to build these things. Now these have a wacky connector here, which connects to the back of the Xbox, but we don't want that. So first thing we'll do is get rid of that. We'll bare some of this outside insulation and be careful. I'm just scoring it here to not cut the insulation on the four wires inside. And the white and green are what operate the remote switch. The red and black are the plus 12 volts and the ground. Before we strip the other two, let's have a look at how that switch works. Now the amber light is when the power supply is off and in standby, and as we connect the red and white, the LED on the power supply goes green and it turns on. We'll strip the remaining wires. We're going to tin those, so apply a bit of flux. And load some solder onto the iron. Now for the connector, I'm using a 4-pin GX16 connector or an aviation connector. There's two screws that hold this crimping part down, and then there's a smaller screw that holds the connector in place. I like to mark, I always use pin 1 and 2 for the positive and negative. So I like to mark pin 1 so it's easier to see when I'm soldering. They are numbered, but it's like a raised lettering that's the same color and it's hard to see. A bit of flux on the 4 pins. We'll tin those. And before we solder the wires to the connector, you want to make sure you slip on the back part of the connector. And I like to use a piece of heat shrink to hold the connector in place. I find if you put it in the female part of it, then you got something to hold on to. So everything's tinned, the pin is tinned, the wire's tinned, and as soon as the blob of molten solder that's on the iron touches it, everything melts together in a second. The green and white, the two wires that operate the switch, aren't polarized, so it doesn't matter which order those go on. You saw earlier, when, as long as they connect to each other, that's what will operate the switch. Line up the hole for the little set screw. Be careful not to over tighten this. It threads into plastic and it's easy to strip those threads. This will crimp against the cable, hold everything into place. So that's done. Now we won't wire up a whole mod, but just to show you that remote switch in action, we'll wire up the female part of the connector, which mounts into the mod. Again, I'm marking my pin 1, which is the positive 12 volt, but I won't be wiring those. I'll only wire the 2 pins on top where the switch is going. A little bit of flux on those pins, and of course we'll tin them. Using some 24 gauge wire here. There's no load on the switch. You can use very small wire like this. That's done. Using a little slide switch for the remote switch. Now we'll get that GX16 in there. We'll just finger tighten that. I would normally tighten it down more, but just for the demonstration here. Always give myself at least a quarter inch, half inch more than I need. Strip and tin those. Now the center pin on the switch is common. So we'll tin the center and then either side, either other contact. And when you flip the switch, it connects the center pin to whichever side the slide switch is on. And we're done with this one. We don't even need to open the power supply itself. Let's have a look at that remote switch in action. The LED's amber now, power supply's on standby. Flip the switch, LED goes green, power supply's on. Now for the second one, we'll install the switch about here. We'll need to open this one. There's 4 screws, but they're covered by these little foam inserts, so we'll get rid of those. We're going to reuse them, so put them down somewhere clean so it doesn't collect debris on the adhesive part. We'll need to disconnect that fan there. Now it'll be easier to work on the board. I'm just gonna eye it here, but I'm going by the middle of that opening on the front where the cable sits to know that I'm centered. And then just that I'm far back enough. I'm gonna make a little divot with the file here. Start with a very small drill bit, make a pilot hole. Then we'll move on to the stepper bits. And then the bigger stepper bit. Getting close. That'll work. Gonna clean this up a little. I'm going to remove this protective cover. It's nice and snug. Now, I probably don't need to bother with this, with how snug that went in there, but I'm going to add a bit of hot glue. Make sure that never budges. Now for the board, the green and white wires are what operate the switch. So we'll cut those from the cable. We could wire that right to the switch, but they're not quite long enough. So I'm going to desolder them from the board, and we'll replace them with some longer wires to go reach the switch. Again, using some 24 gauge wire here. I'll mention it again, the switch isn't polarized, so it doesn't matter which side of the switch we're going to solder these two wires to. Now that through hole on the board is plugged with the solid solder, so I'm just kind of lining it up in the hole, and we'll melt the solder in the back and the wire will poke through. Same for the other one. And cut those to length. We'll strip and tin the other side. We'll tin the contacts on the switch. Now we can put this thing back together. Make sure that power contact lines up in the back. The cable sits in a groove there. We'll reconnect the fan. Run that wire for the fan under the piece of tape that it was under. Make sure we got no gaps on the side. This looks good. We'll get our screws back in there. and replace the little foam bumpers. We'll give that a test. Plug it in. I'll prop it up so we can see the LED. Amber is off. Green is on. So that looks like it's working. Now we have to deal with the connector. Like the first one, we'll cut it off. Bare some of that outside insulation off. Now the white and the green aren't being used here, so I'll cut these back. And then we'll strip and tin the power cables. Bit of flux. And load up the iron. Open up our connector. I'll mark my pin 1. We'll just worry about the 2 pins to tin. Slide on our connector and heat shrink. Number 2 done. Apply some heat to the heat shrink. And we'll screw on the back part of that connector. I'll say it again, with that tiny screw here, don't over tighten. You'll strip the plastic threads. Looks good. We'll give this a quick test with an actual mod. Now I'm hitting the fire button. Nothing's happening. Turn the power supply on, and the mod works. So that's great. Second one done. Now, quick recap. We converted 2 Xbox power supplies to power pass-through mods. The second one we did, we wired an external switch on it. And the first one, we used the 2 of the wires in the cable, which power a remote switch on the mod itself here, to turn the power supply on and off. So once again, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.